Who controls the past controls the future. George Orwell. Despite the fact that there are still many gaps, historians argue that most of mankind's past is well known. We know the events that took place in different countries and different peoples, the sequence of these events, and the names and biographies of the rulers of entire dynasties. In addition, scientists use many methods by which they attempt to clarify the details and dates of events, and even to restore the unknown pages of history. Historians believe that the science of history is primarily based on historical documents, as well as archaeological remains and surviving objects of material culture. And in many respects, this is true, but it's actually not so simple. As we showed in the second film of this series, almost all traditional dating methods used today have significant drawbacks and limitations. Moreover, in determining the age of artifacts and ruins with these methods, the margin for error may reach hundreds or even thousands of years. Such examples could be dated incorrectly by thousands of years, and this means the traditional chronology of historical events cannot be absolutely trusted. But it turns out that the story itself is to a large extent a myth, a work of fiction, and the extent by which humanity knows this past is much less than commonly believed. How then can we learn the true history of mankind? Can we discover at least some way to find the truth? Oh, wow. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Thanks for tuning in once again. Really appreciate that. So we're going to go into a whole new investigation. This is a very deep investigation, which helps understand official history, especially when it comes to chronology, or our historical timeline, the one that they gave us growing up in schools, in the education systems. You know, I'm talking about BC, AD, the Dark Ages. Before I begin the video today, I just want to acknowledge that I'm not the first person to research this or show this work, the books we're about to read. We're going to get into the work of Anatoly Fomenko and the research he did proving that our chronology is false, that there are phantoms and duplicates throughout history, and years have been added on. So big shout out to 432 The Drop Radio YouTube channel and Brother Con Drop. He brought me on to the awareness of Anatoly Fomenko's research, and it was like a whole shift in perception, right? Right away, I went to look for Fomenko's books, and I actually found his whole volume, which he calls History, Fiction, or Science. He calls it the New Chronology. So again, I actually found the whole series, like all 20-something books. I shared that with Drop Nation and everybody. We're going to definitely try to get into as much of the books as possible. I've been holding this book collection for about 5 years now, guys. I just thought it was kind of too deep. I think there's a time for everything. So let's get into it. It says here, the New Chronology is a pseudo-historical conspiracy theory. Dodge the hijack. We're going to see the research. We're going to read. We're going to see all his sources. And you guys determine whether this is pseudo. So this is, of course, how they present it. You got to dodge the hijack because they don't want you to know the truth. Let's keep reading what it says. It says, proposed by Anatoly Fomenko, who argues that events of antiquity generally attributed to the ancient civilizations of Rome, Greece, and Egypt actually occurred during the Middle Ages, all right? It was much more recent than they told us. It wasn't ancient at all. Listen, this is deep. This is more than 1,000 years later. The conspiracy theory further proposes that world history prior to AD 1600 has been widely falsified to suit the interests of a number of different conspirators, including the Vatican, the Holy Roman Empire, the Russian House of Romanov, all working to obscure the true history of the world centered around a global empire called the Russian Horde. All right, that's some deep accusations right there on both sides, because now they're calling him a conspiracy theorist. I'm going to show you Anatoly Fomenko's credentials, who he is, and we're going to get into his books. I have about 22, 23 books of his regarding this false chronology. It ain't no play. So we begin with book one, the very first volume, the very first book of history, fiction, or science. And this volume's title is The Issue with Chronology, again by Anatoly Fomenko. Real quick, we're going to learn a little bit about Anatoly Fomenko. Says he was born in 1945. He is full member, academician of the Russian Academy of Sciences, all right? Full member of the Russian Academy of Natural Sciences, full member of the International Higher Education Academy of Sciences, Doctor of Physics and Mathematics, Professor, head of the Moscow State University section of Mathematics of the Department of Mathematics and Mechanics. Okay? This guy, you're talking about conspiracy theory? Oh, really? You can't pull that off on him. We're going to see all his information and sources and research, guys. You're going to see. He also solved Plato's problem from the theory of minimal spectral surfaces. He's the author of the theory of invariance and topological classification of integrable Hamiltonian dynamic systems, laureate of the 1996 National Premium of the Russian Federation in Mathematics for a cycle of works on the Hamiltonian dynamical systems and manifolds invariance theory, author of 200 scientific publications, 28 monographs, and textbooks on mathematics, a specialist in geometry and topology, calculus of variations, symplectic topology, Hamiltonian geometry and mechanics, computer geometry, author of a number of books on the development of new empirical statistical methods and their application to the analysis of historical chronicles, as well as the chronology of antiquity in the Middle Ages. Okay? Now you tell me, this guy, if he has some credentials, somebody to pay attention to when it comes to chronology, he's a math expert. We're talking about time, numbers, and all that. This is your guy. So you saw that Wikipedia page talking about conspiracy theories. Of course, they're going to do that. So now we know the author of this book. Do you see the accumulated knowledge of this person? This guy is not the type of person to write a whole volume on a conspiracy. He ain't going to waste his time on that. This is a guy which, like me, likes to prove things. And he don't play when it comes to numbers. But let's see what he has to say, what he found out with his knowledge. And this is from the publishers of this book. It says, the issue with chronology crowns 30 years of meticulous and extensive research performed by the eminent mathematician Anatoly Fomenko and his colleagues. This research started actually as an unbelievable byproduct of Russian-American competition and moon exploration, when famous NASA scientist Robert Newton discovered a very strange phenomenon in lunar mechanics. This book is also the first volume in history, fiction, or science series, the fundamental oeuvre that exposes and expounds the numerous inveracities of the traditional version of history. The series History, Fiction, or Science contains data and conclusions that aren't anything short of revolutionary. The alternatives offered to classical history are stunning, unorthodox to the extent of being labeled heretical by virtually every scholar of history, and daring enough to be considered preposterous at first sight, although this impression never lasts longer than it takes one to read a few pages attentively, okay? So once you go over the info, you're going to have a change of mind. This ain't a conspiracy. The Vatican wouldn't lie, would they? The Holy Roman Empire wouldn't lie, would they? In the issue with chronology, we are reminded of when the contemporary chronological scale was created and by whom, with the culprits named as the 16th to 17th century clergy that was in charge of all matters historical in that age. We also learned that the consensual model of history had prominent critics ever since its creation. Among them such names as Sir Isaac Newton and Jean Hardouin, curator of Louvre and chief librarian of Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. The author dissects every historical age and analyzes the data from every source imaginable. Roman and Egyptian chronology take a good beating, and it goes rapidly downhill from there. Poggio Bracciolini and Petrarch take the blame for creating the legend of mythical classical age that never was. That never was. We're talking about a glorification of so-called Greeks and Romans. When those were tags and terms, the biblical events are moved a lot closer to us historically, okay? As well as geographically, the biblical Jerusalem being identified with the medieval Constantinople, for instance. Now, this is one of his things that he found Jerusalem right there in Asia, Constantinople. And I have strong reason historically to believe that was one of the Jerusalems or havens that the Israelites had during their time in those areas. The New and the Old Testament swapped their positions on the chronological scale, both exposed as referring to medieval events. Our perception of history begins to change dramatically, even before we're through with the issue with chronology. History is a pack of lies about events that never happened, told by people who weren't there. George Santayana, American philosopher. Be wary of mathematicians, particularly when they speak the truth. St. Augustine. History repeats itself. That's one of the things that's wrong with history. Clarence Darrow. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. George Orwell, 1984. I'm going to read the preface now by Anatoly Fomenko, the author. He says the materials contained in this book correspond to the research that was started in 1973. One might wonder why we should want to revise the chronology of ancient history today and base our revision on new empirical statistical methods. It would be worthwhile to remind the reader that in the 16th and 17th century, chronology was considered to be a subdivision of mathematics, all right? It was part of mathematics prior to having gradually transformed into a field of historical studies considered complete in general and only requiring minor eventual clarifications, leaving the actual edifice of chronology intact. And yet we discover that the contemporary official version of the chronology of ancient history is full of prodigious contradictions and inconsistencies that deserve an attempt of partial clarification and rectification based on the methods of modern statistics at the very least. One often hears the question about what could possibly motivate a mathematician into wanting to study a seemingly historical problem. The answer is as follows. My primary interests are those of a professional mathematician. They are thus rather distant from historical and chronological issues. However, in the early 70s, namely in 1972 to 73, I had to deal with the dates of ancient eclipses during my studies of one of the key problems in celestial mechanics, all right? He started looking into historical eclipses, astronomical information, which made it into the history books. It had to do with computing the so-called coefficient d in the theory of lunar motion. The parameter characterizes acceleration and is computed as a time function on a large historical interval. The computations were performed by Robert Newton, a contemporary American astronomer and astrophysicist. Upon their completion, he had made the unexpected discovery of parameter d, behaving in the most peculiar manner, namely performing an inexplicable leap on the interval of 8th to 10th century AD. This leap cannot be explained by conventional gravitational theory and is improbable to the extent of making Robert Newton invent mysterious extra-gravitational forces in the Earth-Moon system that suspiciously refused to manifest in any other way. This inexplicable effect attracted the professional interest of the mathematician in me. The verification of R. Newton's work showed that his computations conformed to the highest scientific standards and contained no errors. This made the gap in the diagram even more enigmatic. A prolonged pondering of this topic led me to the idea of checking the exactitude of datings of the ancient eclipses that the parameter computations were based upon, since they implicitly affected the result. This idea turned out to have been unprecedented for the scientists that had dealt with the problem previously. Robert Newton himself, an eminent expert in the field of astronavigation and theoretical dynamics of natural and artificial celestial bodies, trusted the ancient historical dates completely and attempted to explain the leap in the behavior of parameter D from within his professional paradigm. That is to say, without the merest hint of the very idea of questioning ancient chronology. I was more fortunate in that respect. I found out that N.A. Morozov, a renowned Russian scientist and encyclopedist, had analyzed the dating of ancient eclipses and claimed most of them to be in need of a revision. This happened as early as the beginning of the 20th century. He offered new datings for a large number of eclipses that were considerably more recent. Having obtained his tables, I repeated Newton's calculations using Morozov's dates in lieu of the consensual ones as input data. I was amazed to discover that the D graph altered instantly and drastically, transforming into a rather even horizontal line that had concurred with the conventional gravitational theory perfectly. The enigmatic leap disappeared along with the necessity to invent fictitious extra gravitational forces. The satisfaction from having finished a body of scientific work successfully was accompanied by a sudden awareness of a very knotty point arising in this respect, one of great peculiarity and paramount importance, namely that of whether the consensual chronology of ancient history was to be trusted at all. All right, so hopefully this ain't too boring for you guys. I hope this is, but to the science guys, hey, I hope this is interesting. Basically, he did his science and he realized something. Numbers don't lie, and our chronology was not to be trusted. 3. Truth can be calculated. The beginning. We begin with the story of a discovery. In the 1970s, Russian mathematician Anatoly Fomenko was working on the problem of celestial mechanics. This research is very important in finding the parameters of the rotation of the moon around the Earth. All right, Dutch the hijack. Suddenly, Fomenko came across an interesting scientific paper which concerned exactly such research. This work is owned by Robert Russell Newton, American astrophysicist and mathematician, the head of NASA's Computer Center, who at the time was working on a network of space navigation. The Americans had calculated their data based on the dates of lunar eclipses as taken from ancient chronicles. This is how they calculated, all right? And these chronicles, 370 eclipses were listed. American scientists had the necessary formulas to analyze them and obtain a complete characterization of the movement of the natural satellite around our planet. The results Robert Newton recorded in his scientific writings fell into the hands of Anatoly Fomenko. If we believe the study of the American astrophysicist, we find that in the interval from about 800 BC to 1000 AD, the movement of the moon changed dramatically. During this time, the moon supposedly began to move faster and then slowed back down to normal speed. All right, Dutch the hijack. Such a cataclysm cannot be explained within the framework of Isaac Newton's gravitational theory and the current movement of the moon around the Earth. According to the laws of physics, the speed of rotation of the moon could not have changed so abruptly. So what's the deal? The American astrophysicists concluded that the action of some inexplicable power was to blame. What kind of power? Why is it no longer manifested? Robert Newton could not explain. Moreover, a discussion on this issue organized by the British Academy of Sciences in 1972 led to nothing. This problem interested the Russian mathematician Anatoly Fomenko, who decided to investigate. Robert Newton's calculations were seemingly correct, but the conclusion seemed very strange. Instead, Fomenko found a solution where it seemed no one thought to look for. Calculations were based on the American astrophysicist's dates of solar and lunar eclipses taken from the ancient chronicles. Namely, they had to investigate those first. It turns out that the dates of the ancient eclipses can occur. I once heard about a Russian scientist, Nikolai Morozov, who expressed the opinion that the old eclipses are dated incorrectly and should be redated. He publishes the results of their calculations in his book, the 7-volume edition called Christ. I read his books, which contained the correspondence tables of the eclipses, and saw the new dates of the eclipses in which Nikolai Morozov set the eclipses of antiquity in the early and late Middle Ages. All right, he's putting it in the Middle Ages, talking about the old world. Then I took Robert Newton's algorithms, retaining all but the dates of the eclipses. So this is what he's doing. I entered the new dates in this algorithm, which were Nikolai Morozov's, and repeated Newton's calculation. When I did that, it turned out that the schedule was constant, a continuous line on the time axis. All right, this is what he's doing. The Sloan effect disappeared, vanished. Gone was the need to come up with mysterious forces in the Earth-Moon system. Thus was solved a trivial problem of celestial mechanics. The case of Robert Newton's calculations and other early suspicions were justification for more research into this subject. Having carefully considered the dating methods that historians and archaeologists use, as well as all the works of Nikolai Morozov, Anatoly Fomenko concluded wrong is not only the dating of the eclipses, but the ancient chronicles too may contain inaccurate information. It was true that new datings of many ancient eclipses offered by N.A. Morozov led to the equalization of the D function diagram, the elimination of strange contradiction from celestial mechanics, and to the discovery of the conformance of an important parameter in the theory of lunar motion to perfectly normal patterns of behavior. It was equally true, however, that fitting something like the idea that the three ancient eclipses described in the history of the prominent ancient author Thucydides took place in the 11th or even the 12th century AD, and not in 5 BC. It is believed today in one's perception proved quite impossible. The issue here is that the dating of the triad of Thucydides can only correspond to these two astronomical precise solutions. The inevitable question that arose in this respect was that of which discipline had been correct in this case, astronomy or contemporary chronology. It had to address several distinguished historians with this issue, including the ones from our very own Moscow State University. Their initial reaction was that of polite restraint. According to them, there was no point whatsoever in questioning the consensual chronology of ancient history, since all dates in question can easily be verified by any textbook on the subject and were proved veracious a long time ago. The fact that the diagram of some parameter D started to look natural after revised calculations based on some flimsy new chronology was hardly of any relevance. Moreover, it would perhaps be better for the mathematicians to occupy themselves with mathematics and leave history to historians. The same sentiment was expressed to me by L.N. Gumilyov. I refrained from arguing with him. The reply offered by the historians failed to satisfy me, firstly due to the fact that chronology, being a problem of calculating dates, bears immediate relevance to applied mathematics. This includes astronomical calculations, the verification of their precision, calendar problems, the interpretation of old writings based on their frequency, characteristics, etc., and may present an extensive number of complex issues. Secondly, becoming familiar with the contemporary chronological tables soon proved that the ancient dates were quoted rather arbitrarily, with hardly any references at all given anywhere, no sources. At best, the first chronological tables get a quote. However, those were compiled relatively recently, in the 16th and 17th century. All right? He's letting you know that was done during the 1500s, 1600s. Delving deeper into the problem revealed that the version of chronology that we agree upon today wasn't the only one available historically. I found out that eminent scientists from various countries expressed the idea that ancient datings required a radical revision. I realized that the answer was the furthest thing from simple, and that shedding some light on the issue would require plenty of time and effort. This is how 1973 saw me commencing work in this direction, aided by my colleagues, most of them professional mathematicians and physicists, okay? People of science here. We know that the traditional version of history was offered by a French philologist, editor, and commentator on ancient texts, Joseph Gallagher, in the second half of the 1500s. This is the guy. This is one of the main guys. In his book, Reclaiming the Chronology, he described the chronology of different nations and is believed to have brought them into line with each other. And he was the first to apply the method of astronomical dating of eclipses. But almost 400 years later, Anatoly Fomenko discovered that the medieval method is flawed and furthermore was used to make greatly significant errors. Therefore, he decided to find a new and more accurate method of dating historical events. This is the only way to possibly recreate the true chronology of world history. Opponents of Fomenko appeared immediately. The first, of course, were historians. Those who have spoken before me are mistaken. Do not take issue with Morozov. This begins with Isaac Newton, his two books. Isaac Newton was the greatest scientist, scientist number one. History, this is not the chronology. History is a process where there are moments associated with the system. I declare that the work of Fomenko on ancient history is irrelevant to mathematical methods. Historians stated that the calculating of dates is an area of history, not mathematics. However, of historians, such behavior was improper. The research progressed rapidly. Over the years that passed since 1973, many points have been clarified and a great volume of interesting information obtained. A lot of it was published by myself and my colleagues in a number of books and scientific articles quoted in the bibliography. The first related publication saw light in 1980. It has to be noted that over the course of time, our opinions on certain chronological problems have changed. Said alterations never concerned the general picture, but occasionally led to significant shifts in our perception of details. Today, we feel that the empirical statistical methods that our chronological research was based upon need to be formulated and coordinated again. This is how the books Chronology 1 and Chronology 2 came to existence. Chronology 1 is based on the first book I wrote on this subject, Methods of Statistical Analysis of Narrative Texts and Their Application to Chronology, identifying and date-independent texts, the statistical chronology of ancient history, the statistics of ancient reports of astronomical events. It was published by the Moscow State University in 1990. A further revised and extended edition appeared in 1996 under the title Methods of Mathematical Analysis of Historical Texts and Their Applications to Chronology. Chronology 1, now remember, when he's saying Chronology 1, he has about 20 books. So these are books. Okay, so book 1, Chronology 1, contains the entire material in a revised, extended, and coordinated form. It contains an extended version of two of my books, Global Chronology and the New Chronology of Greece, the Medieval Age of Classics. Certain important results that get briefly mentioned in Chronology 1 and Chronology 2 were achieved with the aid of outstanding scientists, Professor V.V. Kalashnikov, Doctor of Physical and Mathematical Sciences, Moscow State University, and the National Research Institute for System Studies, Moscow, Russia, and the Senior Scientific Associate G.V. Novosky, candidate of Physical and Mathematical Sciences, the Department of Mathematics and Mechanics, Moscow State University. Experts in fields of probability, theory, studies, and mathematical statistics. The formation of the author's concept of chronology is largely a result of his having collaborated with V.V. Kalashnikov and G.V. Nosovsky for many years, and I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to both of them, all right? So these are the people that are letting us know that chronology is false, and they did it with their expertise through science. I would like to state explicitly that over the period of time, from 1981 and until presently, our collaboration with G.V. Novosky has been constant and very fruitful, as the two of us have published a number of what we consider to be milestones of the new chronology. The formulation of the main principles of reconstructing modern chronology and medieval history is a direct result of the work we have done together over these years, which adds particular importance to this period. Let us briefly describe the structure of Chronology 1 and Chronology 2. The consensual versions of chronology, as well as those of ancient and medieval history, had evolved completely by the 17th century AD and appeared to contain major flaws. Many prominent scientists are aware of this and have discussed it for quite a while. However, the creation of a new concept of history that would be free from inconsistencies proved a truly formidable task. As a science, chronology appeared only in the 1500s AD and has long been a branch of applied mathematics. It is understandable why. Using astronomical calculations to evaluate their accuracy, deciphering old texts engaged in precisely mathematics. So in the 20th century, The evaluation of the accuracy of these calculations as done by a mathematician is quite logical. This work Fomenko began in 1973, and over 8 years he developed new methods of dating. In those years, he worked virtually alone, but fortunately, he later gained associates and work began to move much faster. With the help of his supporters, Fomenko successfully advanced already established methods as well as developed new mathematical and statistical methods of dating. In recent years, several techniques have been created in conjunction with the mathematician Gleb Novossky. In 1981, I had a co-author, Gleb Novossky, and we created new methods to supplement those created by me from 1973 to 1980. Then he began to work together with Vladimir Kalashnikov and with my wife Tatiana Fomenko. Since then, we worked together. Unfortunately, Kalashnikov is no longer with us. He died of a heart attack in 2001. A group of mathematicians, most of them from the Moscow State University, commenced their research of the problem in 1974. The results were most captivating and got covered in a number of monographs and several dozens of publications in scientific periodicals. Let us emphasize that the new concept of chronology is based primarily on applying methods of modern statistics to the analysis of historical sources and extensive cybernetic computations. The main subject of the books, Chronology 1 and Chronology 2, is the research of new empirical statistical methods of finding dependencies in historical texts and derived procedures of dating historical events. The task of recognizing the difference between dependent and independent texts is really one of identifying images. One encounters it in various scientific paradigms, including applied statistics, linguistics, physics, genetics, historical source studies, etc. Finding dependent texts is of great utility as applied to studying historical sources, where they may be traced to a common original that had been lost before our time. He's talking about primary sources. It is also very useful to be able to tell which texts are independent or derived from non-correlated sources. All right, you got to know what a source is. The very concept of text can be interpreted in a wide variety of ways. Any sequence of symbols, signals, and codes can be referred to as text. The sequences of genetic code and DNA chains, for instance. The common problem of finding dependent text is formulated as follows. One has to find similar fragments in long signal sequences, that is, fragments of text that duplicate one another. There is a multitude of methods used for the recognition of dependencies and the identification of similar images available today. We offer several new empirical statistical methods. They might be of use in analyzing historical chronicles, manuscripts, and archive material, as well as in finding the so-called homologous fragment in text of a significantly different, more general nature. This book is divided into several parts or topics for the reader's convenience. This should help us to securely differentiate between proven statistical facts and hypotheses. At the same time, one has to state that such topical division is rather artificial, since the topics really have lots and lots of points in common. It says here, the first topic, solving the problem of statistical recognition of dependent and independent historical texts, formulating new statistical models and hypotheses, as well as verifying them with extensive experimental material of actual historical chronicles. It turns out we're able to acquire general verification of the models offered. In other words, we have managed to discover interesting statistical tendencies that define the evolution of textual information over a period of time, such as what really happens to the data contained in the manuscript during their duplication, etc. The discovery of these tendencies is our first result. The discovered trends are used as basis for the formulation of new methods of dating. The events described in the chronicles. This is achieved by statistical comparison of the chronicles and documents pertinent to the research with the ones possessing confirmed datings. The methods are verified by a large body of correctly dated materials. Their application to the chronicles and documents describing the events of the 17th to the 20th century appears to confirm the efficacy of these methods. Namely, the statistical datings that we got as a result of our research concur with the ones confirmed by traditional methods. The a priori dependent chronicle pairs turn out to be dependent statistically with the use of our methods. The ones that are independent a priori turn out to be independent statistically as well. Experimental examination of voraciously dated chronicles describing the events of 17th to 20th century AD led to the discovery of natural numeral coefficients that allow us to differentiate between a priori dependent chronicles and a priori independent ones in 1974 to 1979. Basically, these numbers are rather small for a priori dependent pairs and rather large for a priori independent ones. This means that nowadays we can compare arbitrary chronicles X and Y and find out whether their proximity coefficients are within the zone that refers to dependent chronicles or the one that refers to independent ones. It is needless to say that the boundaries of these zones were found experimentally. The discovery of the hidden dependencies that define the evolution of information in rather large historical chronicles, as well as the development and experimental verification of the new dating methods, currently comprising a total of 8, is the second principal result of our work. The datings achieved by our methods cannot be regarded as finite, so we shall refer to them as statistical datings and nothing more. We shall occasionally drop the word statistical for the sake of brevity. The above is to say that we regard the empirical statistical dates that we computed to be a result of applying statistical methods to historical materials. Nevertheless, the concurrence of these statistical datings with the ones verified a priori that we have discovered in the interval of 17th to 20th century AD implies that our results are of an objective nature. Mathematical methods developed by Fomenko, Novossky, and Kalashnikov are precise scientific instruments. With their help, you can check almost any historical documents, records, maps, and biographies of royal dynasties. Following certain rules, any document can be formalized. It becomes a kind of statistical unit and can be subjected to rigorous cross-analysis using several methods and tools. To understand these unique methods, it's not necessary to be a mathematician. We will not use many formulas and calculations and deliberately simplify the presentation to show the main concepts, the essence of these methods. And continuing, it says the second topic. It can also be referred to as critical. We analyze the traditional datings of events that occurred in ancient and medieval Europe, Asia, the Mediterranean countries, Egypt, and America. Bearing the reader's convenience in mind, we have collected various materials here that can be found scattered across all kinds of scientific literature and are known to specialists of various profiles, but often remain beyond the awareness of the general public. These materials illustrate serious difficulties that are presently inherent in the problem of scientific dating of historical events preceding the 14th century AD. We shall inform the reader of the fundamental research conducted by the prominent Russian scientist and encyclopedist Nikolai Alexandrovich Morozov, honorary member of the USSR Academy of Sciences, who was the first to have formulated the problem of confirming the ancient and medieval chronology with the means offered by natural sciences in its entirety, in addition to having collected a great volume of critical materials and suggested a number of innovative hypotheses. We shall also report the chronological research conducted by Sir Isaac Newton, who questioned many datings of historical events, and several of the representatives of the critical current in history and chronology. We quote from eminent authorities in the fields of archaeology, source studies, and numismatics, and a variety of other well-known scientists, and extensively compare different points of view so that the readers could develop their own opinions of the problems in question. The primary application of novel empirical statistical methods is the analysis of dates of historical occurrences. This is why we were forced to analyze as many dating versions of events in question as we could find in this day and age. The issue here is that various ancient and medieval chronicles frequently demonstrate significant discrepancies in their datings of certain important events. Attempting to navigate in this chaos of medieval versions, we devote special attention to those reflected in the chronicles of 15th to 16th century AD, due to the fact that the chronologists of that epoch were closer in time to the events described than we are. Subsequent chronological versions of 17th to 20th century are often revisions of derivative material, obscuring and heavily distorting the original medieval meaning. Starting with 16th to 17th century AD, the version of the chronology of ancient history that was created in the works of prominent medieval chronologists J. Scaliger and D. Petavius rigidifies. The main points of the official version of contemporary chronology coincide with those of Scaliger and Petavius. Hence, we are to use the term Scaligerian chronology and refer to the consensual datings of ancient events as to Caligerian datings, okay? So very important, this is one of the persons that was involved in creating the false chronology, Scaliger, and the other guy, Petavius. There was like 3 key persons in doing this. So that's why he's calling it the Scaligerian chronology or datings. We presume the reader to be more or less familiar with the traditional Scaligerian de facto chronology concepts familiar from school and university. We shall thus refrain from quoting the Scaligerian concept in detail. He's letting you know this is what they teach us in school and universities. Considering this knowledge to be in public domain, on the contrary, we shall be making a special emphasis on its inconsistencies. Further on, we shall give a brief analysis of traditional dating methods, datings based on historical sources, archaeological datings, radiocarbon datings, dendrochronology, etc. It is expedient to allow the reader the evaluation of the veracity and the precision of these methods, as well as their application areas. All right. Comparison of texts. Is it even possible to compare different texts? Of course, as usual. After all, every text has a definite meaning. And if we compare not only the text and historical documents, for example, different records, at first glance, describe quite different events that occurred at different times and places. But what if they tell us about the same historical event? It turns out that this is possible, all right? Even though they're in different epochs, the same thing. But how can we recognize it? Of course, in determining if these texts are interrelated or not, we may sense it, but a human may not always assess the information objectively. One's vision can be tainted by childhood stereotypes. If we aren't to rely on subjective opinion, then how to check if historical texts are talking about the same period or different? It often happens that there are 2 descriptions of apparently absolutely no similarity, 2 books ostensibly quite different, but according to mathematical analysis, they are very close, or it's the same exact story. This is what they're telling you guys. If you held in your hands 2 unknown keys, how could you determine if they are the same or different? The easiest way is to insert the keys into the lock. But what if this is not possible? You just have to compare pictures of profiles of the teeth, and if they match, the keys are identical. It might sound incredible, but we can also compare text this way. To do this, we must represent each as a graph, and then we can compare. But how is this done? Every historical text describes the events in sequence, that is, over the years, hence it can be divided into conventional sections. For example, 1 year equals 1 segment. Then consider how much text material applies to every year, that is, for each segment. You can use pages of text, the number of lines, words, letters, or symbols. The main thing is to get a number characterizing the amount of text. On the horizontal x-axis, mark the years, and on the y-axis, note the number of ascribed material. For example, the description of the first year in this text takes up 3 pages, the second 5, the third 0, as sometimes is 4, 10, and so on. The same schedule of building is used for the second text. The 2 broken lines with lots of teeth represent forms of the text. A form is already possible to compare. Peaks, example, the upper point of the teeth are called local maxima, and the method is called the method of correlation of local maxima. In this method, the resulting graph is compared point by point. The heights of points on the graphs do not play a special role. It is more important that for the same year on this time axis, the spikes correspond. If the location of peaks coincide, the profiles of both graphs are dependent. The method was tested on several dozen texts, and each time its effectiveness was proven. It turns out that if the texts tell us about the same event, the peaks in the graphs occur almost simultaneously. This coincidence can be detected by comparing, for example, two texts: The History of Rome by ancient Roman historian Titus Livy, and Essays on the History of Ancient Rome by Soviet historian Vladimir Sergeyev. The shapes of these texts make spikes almost simultaneously. Look at that, it matches, guys. It turns out we are talking about the same events. In this case, it is quite clear from the titles both books tell us about ancient Rome. Using this method, let's consider the records which tell of the alleged events of quite different dates. We have the tale of bygone years, believed to have been written in the 900, 1000 ADs, and here, Nikiphoroshaka Chronicle, which according to historians was written in the 1300 to 1400s. Historians claim that these documents are separated by a nearly 4th-century gap and describe very different events. But the graphs of these records suddenly coincide. Dry mathematical calculations prove that we are probably talking about the same historical time, okay? It's a duplicate, it's the same exact time. One of them is fake. This means that the age of one of the documents is incorrect and the error is 300 to 400 years. Such examples are many examples of this, guys, okay? Therefore, using only statistics and mathematics can there be truly objective analysis of old texts. Without such methods, unfortunately, constructing a chronology is impossible. If a person sees that the shape of the keys are the same, he comes to the only correct conclusion: the keys open the same lock. And if one were to insist that the keys are different, would he believe? Hardly. Proof for him in this case is obvious and has tangible proof, all right? He's a scientist, he knows what he's talking about. Continue, says here the third topic. In 1975, 1979, the author compiled a table entitled Global Chronological Map, which may be referred to as GCM for the sake of brevity. It may be regarded as a rather complete Scaligerian textbook of ancient and medieval history. All the principal events of ancient history, with their dates according to Scaliger, the ones used today, list of main historical characters, etc., were placed along the horizontal axis of time, all right, a chronological time, a timeline. All the key original sources that have survived with descriptions of contemporary life were quoted for each epoch. The resulting chronological map contains tens of thousands of names and dates. The physical space it covers amounts to several dozen square meters. This map proved itself a priceless encyclopedia and a great guide for the edifice of contemporary Scaligerian de facto, ancient and medieval chronology. Due to the large volume of the material, it made its way into Chronology 1 and Chronology 2, with many expurgations as small tables and diagrams. Continuing, says here the fourth topic. In 1974, 1979, the entire arsenal of the new empirical statistical dating methods was applied to the factual material collected on the map of the Scaligerian chronology. This was done by inspecting all manner of pairs of historical epochs and the key original sources pertinent to them. These chronicles were processed statistically and then compared in pairs, and eventually the dependence coefficients of compared historical texts were computed. If such coefficients for the two compared chronicles, X and Y, proved to belong to the same numeric order as those of the a priori dependent chronicles from the certainty interval of 17th to 20th century AD, we call them statistically dependent. In this case, both correlating epochs, temporal periods, were marked on the map with the same arbitrarily chosen symbol, such as the letter R. So he's kind of breaking down how they was trying to see similarities, and he was pointing out these similarities in different chronologies, right, in different historical periods. We're talking about different historical stories, and he was tagging them with letters. So if he saw something that happened in 2000 BC, and then he saw something that happened in 200 AD that was very, very similar, everything, almost the exact same thing, he would mark them with the same letter. So in this case, he's saying for example, he used such letter as R. If the proximity coefficient or measure of the two compared chronicles X and Y proved to belong to the same numeric order as those of the priori independent chronicles from the certainty interval of the 17th to 20th century AD, we call them statistically independent. In this case, both correlated epochs, temporal periods, were marked on the map with different arbitrary chosen symbols, such as the letters N and S, right, if they don't match. As a result of statistical research, pairs of statistically dependent chronicles and epochs pertinent to them were found and exposed in the Scaligerian history textbook. We call such chronicles and the sequences of events they describe statistical duplicates, all right? Duplicates. He's letting you know he found duplicates in history, in the chronology, meaning the same story, the same exact thing duplicated later on in the timeline, just given different names. He called that statistical duplicates. We discovered that the results of using different empirical statistical methods correlate very well, namely, the chronicle pairs statistically similar. According to one method, turned out to be statistically similar, according to all the others, if such methods were at all applicable to the chronicles in question. This result correlation is perceived as important. It is vital that our empirical statistical methods have found no unforeseen duplicates or chronicles whose dependent nature we weren't aware of a priori on the interval of 17th to 20th century AD. At the same time, the same methods found a large number of new statistically similar chronicles, duplicates, that were previously considered underived, independent in every sense of the word, and ascribed to various epochs before the 17th century AD, preceding the 11th century in particular. All right, I don't know if you guys understood that, but basically, he found duplicates. They were able to find duplicates that were previously considered to have nothing to do with each other, like independent stories, independent people from independent epochs, but they were actually the same story, the same people, just one was a duplicate. The compilation of the Scaligerian chronological map and the discovery of statistical duplicates therein amounts to the third principal result of this book. The fourth principal result is the division of the Scaligerian chronological map into a sum of the four chronicle layers discovered by the author. Four different layers. These chronicle layers are nearly identical, but they are shifted in time in relation to each other. These shifts amount to a significant amount of time, and their corresponding chronicle layers may be regarded as short chronicles of sorts. A very rough description of the contemporary Scaligerian textbook of ancient and medieval history would be calling it a sum or a collage of four copies of the same short chronicle, statistically speaking, all right? So I'm explaining that in case you didn't understand that. Basically, going with the modern chronology that we use today, or the Scaligerian chronological map, it's like seeing four copies of the same historical story, same historical people, four copies of that in one, which they made seem like it were different people in different epochs. This is literally what he's letting you know he found. A criticism of the Scaligerian chronology and the description of the four statistical results mentioned above comprise the main part of the present book. Its other parts are of a hypothetical and interpretational nature. They aid the formulation of a possible answer to the naturally occurring question about the meaning of all the discovered empirical statistical facts and what the history was really like. Okay? Maps. Ancient maps can also tell a lot of interesting things. After all, what is a map? A representation of humanity's view of the world at the time it was created. It is natural to assume that all began with primitive patterns such as these here. But navigation was developed, wars were fought, and trade links were established, and along with them, new information about lands and countries. Information was very important for every country, so they needed to map, and with every new generation, maps were becoming better and more accurate. For example, a very rare map in 1522, Europe, and Asia are very different from a modern image. Greenland is depicted as a peninsula of Europe. The Black Sea is skewed vertically. The Caspian Sea is almost unrecognizable. China is generally absent. All right, China is absent. A map of Cornelius Nicholas in 1598 also contains distortions, but they are already much less than the previous map. And this, a unique monument of European cartography, the large globe Blauw, made famous by Dutch firm Blauw in the late 1600s by the order of Swedish King Karl XI. To what the naked eye can see, it is much closer to reality than the previous map. The outlines of the continents have become much more precise. There are many new lands. These examples clearly show that for each new era of maps, the number of erroneous geographic information decreased and the number of correct features increased. This is similar to how children draw. According to their maturity, the way a 6-year-old will draw the world around us is very simple and naive. A 10-year-old child's proportions are bound to be more realistic, with people already more or less similar to humans. Fantastic characterizations most likely will not be present. And a 60-year-old will try to draw all the details and features as closely to how they are seen. Confusion of the sequence of these steps is almost impossible. You can also compare maps as such. But for serious study, only visual comparison are not enough. It is necessary to obtain scientific data. Which leads us to the method of Anatoly Fomenko, which he called the proper method of chronological ordering and dating of ancient maps. Take a few ancient maps, for example, a map Chadel made, as the historians believe, in 1493. A map Peter Appian supposedly made in 1520, a map Solinusa made in 1538, and a map from the Satin Mercadora and Hinduist in 1607. Each map will be assigned a serial number according to the official date of its appearance. Next, we need to get a full description of each map. To do this, we compile a table containing all the information about the map. It is a flat map or a globe, global or regional, all right? Flat map or globe. The orientation of the parts of the world, the location of the poles, the equator, the characteristics of the seas, countries, and so on. This table of geographical features Anatoly Fomenko called a map code. In fact, it is a formalized characterization of maps. The same characterization is made for the other maps we are comparing. Now for the collected information used to construct the chart. Horizontally, we note the serial number of the map, the vertical, the number of abnormal features. Let's say there are 24 at most. With each new map, abnormal features will gradually subside, and what's right, such as the exact shape of the coast, will remain. Thus, the total number of abnormal features will diminish and the graph will curve going down. Then the same method was applied to the maps of antiquity and early medieval period. It turned out that the resulting dates are not absolutely consistent with what we know from modern tables. For example, the famous maps of Ptolemy, supposedly antique maps of 200 AD, came out to being in the 14 to 1500s AD. You hear that? Moving up the time axis at least 1,000 years. It's not from 200 AD. Furthermore, for example, maps of Hesiod or Euclid also proved to be far from the 5th or 3rd century BC and were in the Middle Ages during the 1100s to 1200s AD. Guys, you see what he's saying? The maps were made in those times. The famous Peutinger map, an antique map of the Roman Empire, also has risen along the timescale in places in the 1400s AD. Before us, the famous map of Hans Rusten in 1480, clearly, it doesn't even look like a map, but just a beautiful picture. In principle, this corresponds to the development of cartography in the 1400s. Now, for comparison, we take one of the so-called ancient maps of Ptolemy. The contradiction is obvious. This map, allegedly from 200 AD, is consistent with the geography of the era of Columbus. It seems as though much before the 1400s, in times of antiquity, mankind created detailed maps of sufficiently high detail. Then he suddenly lost all knowledge and skills and went back into a primitive state. You see, it's going backwards. However, mankind has not experienced any global catastrophes. Its development was not interrupted, and the new generations did not have to start their knowledge from scratch. From where did these supposedly ancient yet rather realistic maps originate? On this paradox, cartographic historians themselves cannot explain, but we can come to an explanation using the method for ordering maps by Fomenko. This method allows us to calculate the true time of occurrence of the so-called ancient maps of Ptolemy. They were created not earlier than the 1400s, 1500s AD, okay? That's when they were created. Who's the so-called Greeks? This means that the traditional chronology is subject to not just negligence, but errors of hundreds and sometimes thousands of years. Thousands of years, guys, false chronology. It is unlikely that someone would believe that a small child who just learned to keep a pencil in his hand could draw an accurate and vivid portrait of a man. And then, instead of the correct picture, once again began to primitively draw trees and people, all out of proportion. Such a sequence is unlikely. Most likely, these children's drawings are just mixed, and so they are. It's the only explanation. Continuing, it says here the fifth topic. This topic can be called interpretational. This is where we offer the hypotheses that may explain the trends we have discovered and the reasons why the Scaligerian textbook of history might contain duplicates. Neither this material nor the truncated history textbook that we offer are to be considered finite in any way. They may only be regarded as offering a possible version that requires a great body of work to be conducted by experts of various profiles and maybe even special research facilities, all right? So that's where we come in, guys. The author's precision on a significant number of points raised in Chronology 1 and Chronology 2 has formed as a result of interaction, collective research, and extensive discussions with specialists from a wide variety of fields, most notably the field of mathematics and fellow mathematicians. Specifically, the new statistical models and the results we have achieved have all been presented and discussed over the span of the past 20 plus years. The fourth and the fifth International Probability Theory and Mathematical Statistics conferences in Vilnius, Lithuania, 1981 and 1985. The first International Bernoulli Society of Mathematical Statistics and Probability Theory Congress in Uzbekistan in 1986, and so on, guys. Look, you can pause it, you can see. Basically, what he's saying is that he has presented this information. People are informed. True academics have attended these discussions, these presentations. Continues that the author would like to give thanks to all the participants of the discussion and the members of the audience. The author also expresses his gratitude to the following members of the Russian Academy of Sciences for their kind support and collaboration. And so he starts naming all his colleagues, people that maybe helped him get this volume, the series going. All these mathematicians. These are their names right here. And I'm not going to read them all, but you guys can see. And many collaborators as well he has. Many collaborators, as you guys can see. Many with high credentials. And that's where he ends his preface, okay? Thanking everybody. And who he has dedicated it to. Phantom dynasties. Among historians, there is a long-held perception that sometimes a chronicler, while describing their recent rulers, would also make mention of other long-dead ancient kings. The traditional story assures us that such strange fascination with members of antiquity was widespread among chroniclers. Because of this, there are many instances where biographies will also mention ancient rulers. To track such reoccurrences, it's not enough to simply examine a large number of historical biographies. This information must somehow be quantified. To do this, Anatoly Fomenko developed a table, which he called a form code. In the form of a questionnaire, one can apply any chronicle or biography, and then investigate it despite the questionable assessment of the chroniclers. A form code consists of 34 items and contains detailed information about a ruler. His gender, lifespan, duration of reign, status, an emperor, military leader, religious leader, etc. Cause of death, natural disasters, astronomical phenomena, wars, conspiracies, and other things that happened during his reign. All right, gather all that information, he's saying. Anatoly Fomenko then did a tremendous job. He created questionnaire codes of several hundred major ancient rulers. And now we can simply take any form code and compare it with others. It is very important that with this method, not only the individual's biographical chronicles can be compared, but whole dynasties of rulers. We can then compare two dynasties. From each dynasty, we can choose, for example, 20 profile codes of kings who ruled successively, that is, one after another. Of such a sequence, Anatoly Fomenko called a flow of form codes. First, he compared the form codes of the first ruler of a dynasty and the first ruler of another dynasty. Then he compared the following form codes and so on. In such a comparison, it's important to know that if only two comparable biographies are found, it doesn't mean anything. We can find many similar biographies in history. And it is clear that no chronological conclusions follow from this. To calculate how similar two dynasties are, Anatoly Fomenko has developed a special factor which is used to compare each set of questionnaires codes. For clarity, well-compared flows of form codes can be represented graphically. Note the horizontal serial number of each chosen our ruler's first dynasty, and the vertical, the duration of his tenure in years. Fomenko calls it a dynasty profile. Such a profile can be constructed for any kind of dynasty, and such a profile will be particular only to it. From this profile, a dynasty can always be identified. We construct such a graph for the second dynasty. Now the resulting forms can be compared. Byzantium 600 and England 800. You see that? It's almost the same story. Whatever he's comparing, look, check it out. Fomenko called this the principle of small distortions. He assumes that the chroniclers, though sometimes mistaken in duration of a ruler's reign, were still fairly accurate. Consequently, profiles obtained on the basis of these records can be considered to be a fair portrayal. From birth, every person has characteristics that set them apart from all other people on the planet, not only from his contemporaries, but also from his descendants and ancestors. How can we compare two profiles of people? The names are different biographies, different documents. But can we go by resemblance? Appearances can be changed, hair can be dyed, mustache and beard glued, plastic surgery. But DNA and fingerprints cannot be changed. They are individual and unique. Therefore, having a sufficient database, you can always find out what person is behind a new appearance or name. Dynasty profiles calculated by mathematicians are like fingerprints or DNA, all right? And if suddenly some sort of historical document reveals a new, supposedly unknown dynasty, you just need to create its profile and compare it with profiles from the database. This chart shows the profiles of two ruling dynasties. The ancient kingdom of Judah, all right, 600 BC, and the Eastern Roman Empire, 300 and 700 AD. He's going to compare it. This is what he's doing here. Remember how he did that graph? And here are profiles of the ruling dynasties. The medieval Holy Roman Empire, 900 to 300 AD, and the medieval Habsburg Empire, 1200 to 1650 AD. Look at this. Same, guys. One is a duplicate, one is real. If we arrange these profiles on opposite sides of the axis, they are almost symmetrical. Does this mean they belong to the same dynasty? Visual similarity should be questioned. To do this, we need to calculate the probability of accidental coincidence. It turns out that this probability is negligible. There is roughly 1 chance in 100 billion for a dynasty of kings in different times and in different countries to be so similar to each other. All right, literally, it's impossible. In the official dynastic history, such duplicates are found quite a lot. We have found pairs of dynasties which are now considered to be totally different, ruling in different countries in different times. For example, a dynasty of rule in ancient Rome and the other in medieval Europe. Nevertheless, our method unexpectedly showed that the graphs of these dynasties are strikingly similar, so close that we can automatically associate a pair of dynasties as the same. It's the same history. One's a duplicate, all right? One's false. Such pairs we call duplicates, phantoms. They turned out to be quite a lot. A few dozen, there's a lot in history. Phantoms. That's because this method showed that some of the ruling dynasties were simply copied in history, duplicated only on paper. How could this happen? All right, duplicated on paper genocide. Likely for 2 reasons. First, the error could be random due to weak development of linguistics at that time. For example, 2 ancient documents describe the same dynasty, but interpreters of text misinterpreted them as talking about different dynasties. Therefore, they gave them new names and moved them on paper, not only to other places, but also to other times. Secondly, and this is the main reason for such mistakes, is intentionally. For some powerful forces of the Middle Ages, it must have been important to rewrite history for the sake of hiding something, okay? You guys hear that? Somebody hid history, rewrote it. We will talk about this in detail in the following films. We're going to read about that, guys. Ordering historical texts in time. The detection of duplicate dynasties leads us to new thinking. Perhaps not all historical events are set out in the chronological order in which they actually happened. Maybe we have to look into that. That's what he's saying. Now that he knows there's a lot of duplicates. A chronicler in describing events is sure to mention the kings and important people of his era. It is natural to tell of what interests him most. For a chronicler, it is very important that nothing is confused, and so he tries to accurately describe his characters, giving everyone a separate name. These names of historical characters is the best guide in the analysis of texts. A personal diary can tell a lot about its owner. For example, a boy Peter's diary. He was in high school and was friends with John and Mary. The names of John and Mary occur literally on every page and several times. But gradually mentioning of them decreases. It is understandable why Peter graduated from high school and enrolled at a university. He has another life and new friends. Of John and Mary, he sees less often, and closer to the end of the notebook, their names disappear entirely. It is also understandable Peter graduated from the university, began a family, and no longer sees his high school friends. The same logic holds for the historical chroniclers. Each new generation creates new heroes. Therefore, the chronicler, passing from one account to another, changes characters and narratives. All right, they're just changing the names of the same person. This simple principle has been useful for creating a method of dating. To check if there is a break in the chronological order of events, we construct a graph. Horizontally, we note the sequence of parts of the text. Vertically, the number of all occurrences of all historical figures after having been mentioned in any part of the chronicle. If the events are described in the correct chronological order, the curve on the graph will decrease. Such a graph can be constructed for each part of the record and for each mentioned character. This principle, Anatoly Fomenko called the principle of attenuation of frequencies, and the method based on this principle, the method of chronological ordering of text over time. Repeatedly proved by historical documents from 1600s to 1900s, this method is fully confirmed. Hence, the history of this time really is what they claim it to be. But when applied to the earlier chronicles, incredible things happen. Graphs of ancient chronicles built with the help of Fomenko often gave a broken line with unexpected bursts instead of a decreasing curve. That is, the names of long-forgotten historical figures appear with the same frequency throughout. And that's not a current historical blunder, but it occurs in the ancient chronicles themselves, brought down through history. If they were put back in order, the shape should be more appropriate when the curve is going down. If the last pages of Peter's diary only talks about long-forgotten high school friends, what can it mean? Peter suddenly forgot all those around him? He no longer communicates with university friends and colleagues? Does he not initiate new acquaintances and his life is now only John and Mary? It is hard to believe. More likely, this page simply dropped from the beginning of the diary and was accidentally added to the end. These examples we have shown clearly demonstrate how mixed up mankind's history is. The chronology of this history is not just broken in a few places, but requires a complete and thorough review. Okay? This is truth right here. We've been fed lies. How can we see all the contradictions of the standard version of history? Perhaps we should make a map of all the traditional chronicles? At first glance, it seems impossible, but nevertheless, the task was doable. All right, guys, this is what they did. This is really deep. Global chronological map. This is what Anatoly Fomenko eventually did. Okay, this is amazing. Anatoly Fomenko decided to find out how the world really looks as a story. To this end, he achieved a tremendous feat. He studied hundreds of ancient texts, tables, records, books, reviewed the ancient and medieval history of Europe, Egypt, Middle East, and the Mediterranean. You think this is conspiracy? This guy did his research. He studied most of the documents which describes the major events of human history, which allegedly occurred over the course of 6,000 years, from 4000 BC to 2000 AD. To provide all this information visually, Anatoly Fomenko made a document for which there had been no precedent. He worked on it for 6 years. All right, 6 years. All the information collected, he depicted on a large chronological scale, elongated along the horizontal time axis. You guys hear he made a big chart, a big poster. It consisted of the precise dates on which the founders of our traditional version of history insisted, Scaliger and Petavius. First maps were drawn on graph paper, then the scanned images were transferred to a special material. This unique method affects its size. The length of the map is 19 meters, and it was the first to graphically depict the history that is taught in schools and universities, okay? That's how long this bug, he put it in a gym. He was like, I'm gonna put the world's timeline on a wall. This map contained tens of thousands of names, several thousand dates, information about a disturbance, the main books of the original sources, etc. The chronicles of their dating, the author's chronicle, the author, occurrences in astronomy, and so on. Then this material was evaluated using the techniques developed by me and my colleagues. And I noted on this map where there were duplicates, that is, periods that were shown to be similar by these methods. How was this done? Anatoly Fomenko divided the history of the world at certain points. Then every era detailed was displayed on the time axis. Periods which had similarities were moved to be simultaneous on the time scale. To show how much overlap there is in the traditional chronology of historical events, Fomenko assigned each time interval a letter. For example, the era of the Second Roman Empire was marked by the letter K. This same letter was used to mark its duplicates Fomenko had discovered, okay? So he put all the Ks together. Other historical periods as well as their duplicates were identified by other letters, for example, C and P, and were also marked on the map. So a structure emerges that shows both the time axis and repetitions of historical events. This map was named Global Chronological Map, all right? This is what he did. This is amazing, guys. He was able to see the duplicates. That is, it shows what should be the true chronology of historical events. It became apparent that in the traditional chronology, there are 3 major time shifts, guys, by approximately 300 years, 1,000 years, and 1,800 years. And lots of real historical events of the Middle Ages were copied on paper by medieval chroniclers and sent into the past. All right? Things that happened in the Middle Ages, they put in BC times. How could this happen if the chroniclers of the Middle Ages made unintentional mistakes? He's asking, did they make mistakes? Take the 4 ancient chronicles. They all describe the same events that occurred, for example, in Europe in the 1400s. But the authors of these chronicles were living not only in different countries, but even at different times. They spoke and wrote in different languages and used a different calendar, even though they said the exact same thing. Not surprisingly, in telling of the same king, city, or battle, they gave them totally different names, all right? So even though the names changed, the situation, what was happening was the same. Therefore, when chroniclers in the 1500s, 1600s read these records, they decided that they were talking about 4 very different eras. And instead of putting these accounts simultaneously on the time axis, they arranged them in sequence, that is, one after another. All right, they started making them duplicates. They left one chronicle in the 1400s, all right, a second they pushed back 300 years, a third back 1,000 years, and a fourth back 1,800 years, guys. Put them all together and you get a very long history, all right? They pushed us way back in BC times. Only with the help of mathematical statistics can we have a truly objective analysis of old texts. Without them, unfortunately, it is impossible to construct a chronology. Therefore, to us, the current chronology was never truly established. It was based on very subjective methods. Basically, it's fake. As long as the chronology did not use the methods of mathematics, statistics, and astronomy, the field of history will be very subjective and have a very shaky foundation. We can say that today the project, The New Chronology by Fomenko Nosowski, consists of 2 parts. The first part, new mathematical methods for the study of old texts and maps, as well as first made new chronological map. This map exists on the basis of evaluating ancient historical texts and maps using all the aforementioned methods. The second part, this is a tentative reconstruction of history based on the new chronological scale. In reconstructing chronology, mathematicians Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Novossky realized that it was necessary to reconstruct world history. All right, you have to rewrite history because traditional history rests on the false chronology, because it's based on a false chronology. The academic Fomenko is supported by other prominent scientists. His studies began to attract the attention of colleagues not only in Russia but also abroad. In Germany, similar studies involved Eugene Gabovich, mathematician, historian, writer. His work on historical analytics inherently developed the theory of Anatoly Fomenko. When I talk about the new Russian history, I use the term chronological revolution, and with her, I have great hopes that the history of philological and ideological lies about the past, which do not describe the past, or at best describe a kind of fantasy past, may eventually become an actual part of the past. Alexander Alexandrovich Zinovy, a prominent Russian philosopher and writer, a professional logician, having studied the works of Fomenko and Novossky, he immediately became their advocate. When I met with a book by Fomenko, I was just shocked. I was delighted. Within a few days, I became truly impressed by the book. For the first time in my life, I was faced with a truly great scientific discovery. All right, a great scientific discovery. Vitaly Sundakov, a journalist and traveler. I think Anatoly Fomenko is not only a brilliant scientist, but also one of the most prominent figures in the 20th to 21st century, comparable to Giordano Bruno or Galileo. Regarding the search for true chronology, this involved Isaac Newton and Nikolai Morozov and other scientists, but as for scientific methodological analysis, the math, this, of course, was shown to the world by Fomenko. The results of mathematicians Fomenko and Novossky were a hit. The new methods have helped to find answers to mysteries that historians still consider unsolved. Also, the methods have uncovered historical facts that were simply unknown. For example, it turned out that it radically changed Russian history. If European and Asian history is artificially lengthened, then Russian in turn is shortened considerably. All right? Fomenko's methods revealed that many of the most legendary historical characters actually existed. It turned out that they are just historical counterparts, phantom reflections of actually existing historical figures. All right? They're duplicating people. Sadly, realize that for many years, humanity has had to deal with a great historical hoax, okay? All the events that allegedly occurred before the 900s AD are phantom reflections of the actual events of the Middle Ages, that is, the 1000s to 1600 ADs, all right? They're duplicates. They put people way back in time. Phantom timelines. They were incorrectly dated and substituted for the real history of mankind. Therefore, the authors of the new chronology take on a great scientific importance, all right? I believe that this discovery is one of the greatest historical discoveries of the 20th century and the most significant discovery in the process of knowing the past of mankind. All right, guys, I agree. That's what we're bringing this to you guys, all right? Even though I've been holding this for years, Draw's been telling everybody for years, all right? This is deep. On what appears to be the real history of mankind, according to Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Novossky, we will describe in detail in the following films of our popular series, History, Science, or Fiction. The films will be seen as unusual, striking, and even shocking. So I hope you guys enjoyed this presentation, this first video on this research that Anatoly Fomenko did with the new chronology and the false chronology that we've been given all our lives. We're actually going to continue reading the book. I actually want to get into the details of each chapter, each book, so you guys can see. Not sure if I can get through everything in every single book because there's like 20 books, but we'll try to pull out the babies as much as we can. Again, this series is just starting, so we're definitely going to continue. Hope you guys enjoyed the little video as well, something visual, you know, not me just reading all the time. And again, shout out to Drop for bringing this to our awareness years ago. When we come back, we're going to read this part one here. It says Roman chronology as the foundation of European chronology. All right, and we're going to take a look at this chapter on the next video. So thanks for tuning in once again. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Wow.